So we have a signal, we have a way of firing that signal in our logic. Let's look at how we subscribe to that firing event. All right, the very first stop that we've got here is the vplay docs again, and this is vplay.net/docs/apps-how-to-model-view-separation. Or if you look over in the menu on the left-hand side, it's model and view separation. Now we're looking at this because you might be wondering why we've created a logic item and we have pages all separate to that, and we're actually about to create another thing that sits between those two. Well, that's because if we read through some of this stuff, it says, why should you care about separation of concerns? Why should we separate all of these things? So what are we doing here? Well, the core concept here is we have property bindings. So when you've got items on your screen, they're bound to a property in your code. And when that property changes, the item on the screen changes. And you kind of expect that these days. And things weren't actually always like that, but they are now for the most part. So that is very handy, but it creates issues. Because if you're listening to the properties of many different items, they could all be talking to each other in ways and timings that you don't have a handle on. And that's going to cause issues, and it can cause very big issues. You might get circular dependencies or loops, as it says here. And if that happens, clearly you've done something wrong with the architecture. Now, this is a problem not just here, but in every framework practically that you come across with a GUI on it. And the solution for it is model view controller, model view view model, or Flux. So all these things essentially do is separate out the model, the view, and the controller that controls it all. So you always want to try and have a separation of concerns. And if you've programmed for a few years, you should know these things already. So this documentation tells us each content view of your vPlay app is usually composed as a page. And the page is a view controller, which provides and displays data for the user. So the page is actually two things in one, the data model and the page itself. So if we walk through all of this, it actually tells us in the docs the way that it recommends we take is to have the following flow, which is actually inspired by the Flux architecture designed by Facebook. And you can go ahead and look that up, and you will find a couple of Medium articles that tell you all about it. But basically, at its heart, we have an action, we have a dispatcher. This is like the central control point that says this action has happened, it's an event. It sends that off to whatever stores have subscribed to it, and the stores update their relevant views. Now, you may think that's not much different to all the other stuff you've just shown me, but in reality it is. It gets rid of that problem where you get this kind of spider web of property listeners. So if we scroll down, because there's a lot for you to take in, and it's easier if you just read this yourself at your own leisure, but this is the important This is the important image for you guys to know about. We want to have logic. We want to have a data model. That data model will update a page. Okay, and then when you interact with the page again, you'll notice these arrows come across again back to the logic. So, for example, in our app, when we interact with the page and we press search, it goes back to logic and it fires off the search. The data model listens to the search event or the signal. When it gets its new data, it updates the page. Okay, so what we're missing is that data model that takes care of that role. So let's head back to our project. And what are we going to do? Where should we put this? Well, we should put it in models. Let's add new. We want an item. And let's just call this data model so we don't confuse ourselves. In a much larger app, you'd call this something like search data model or search page data model, perhaps something like that, depending on how you want to name things. Okay, let's go ahead and create that. Right, so the first thing we don't need is the ID. We don't need that explicitly. What do we need? Well, because this is going to make some calls, we need to have our client, which you recall is actually our HTTP client. And then it needs to define some connections. So this is kind of the other half of our signals, and that's connections with two ends. That's why it's complaining. We're going to give these connections an ID called logic connection. And then we're going to say to it, when you hear the search listings signal fire, do something. So how do we subscribe that? So let's go to our logic there. Here's our search listings. Okay, so we know where we are. Let's go back to our data model. You'd think it would be something like search listings. And you'd be close, but you'd be wrong. We use the standard on search listings. And we've seen on click, on change before. So on is the secret magic keyword when it comes to this. On search listings. What do we want them to do on search listings? Well, for now, let's just have a console.debug. And let's say to ourselves, signal search listings works. So we're just going to send this back to ourselves. Just a nice test message so when we run a search, we can see that it's actually working. Okay, now this isn't going to work yet. Why? Because the data model hasn't been declared somewhere. And of course, I've told you where we declare stuff, our property cross main item. So inside of here, let's say, hey, I want a data model. And we, of course, are going to give this an ID with our camel casing of data model. And then we're going to give it something called a dispatcher. So who's it going to listen to? Who's its dispatcher telling it to do stuff? Well, that's going to be the logic, which is here. So it's going to listen up to the logic. Otherwise, it wouldn't know that the logic was firing signals. So you've got to tell it explicitly, go and listen to this. Okay, and it's giving us an error because we haven't defined the dispatcher yet inside the data model. So if we go back to our data model, we can go ahead and do that. Somewhere up at the top, create a property, alias dispatcher. And what's this going to do? Well, it's going to tap into our logic connection dot target. I've just noticed I need to put an A into dispatcher. So if we save that and then look at, where was I? Not logic, property cross main page. No, in the main item. There we go. Now our dispatcher correctly assigns logic. So if you go back to that page that I showed you at the beginning of this and you read it through thoroughly, spend half an hour on it because it actually takes that long to get this in your head. It's not something I can really explain in a 3-minute lecture because it's quite tough to get. Basically, you have a dispatcher, you have a listener that sends off the data to a data model. Okay, so we've set all that up. We can go ahead, save this, and we can run this inside the live view. And now when we click go, it should fire off that signal which we've subscribed to, and it will tell us signal search listings works. And every time we click it, we get that signal. And you know what's beautiful about this is when we're in the main page, the search page rather, and we're firing off this search function, it's just accessing that one instance of logic. It's searching the listings, and it doesn't have to know anything else, right? It doesn't have to receive back the data because that's taken care of somewhere else. And where is it taken care of? It'll be taken care of in this magical callback object I keep referring to that we're going to address in the next lecture.